Welcome to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Professor Paul Youngbin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here is Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim.
I'm happy to have Dr. Michelle Loyd-Paige here today. Dr. Michelle R. Loyd-Paige is a woman who loves God, loves family, loves life, and enjoys good food. The firstborn child of two African Americans, Michelle identifies as an African American woman and has spent much of her adult life teaching about the beauty and challenges of diversity, fighting for justice, and preaching the love of God. Michelle began traveling the world at a young age as her father's military duty stations changed every 3 or so years. It was this constant movement to lands near and far that guided her to become a bridge builder. Michelle earned her PhD in Sociology from Purdue University. She and her husband Darrell have been married for over 39 years and have 3 adult children. She is the founder of PreachSista, a ministry that creates space for people to deepen their faith and care for their souls. She's a co-host of the Antioch Podcast, a podcast hosting and modeling conversations on biblical anti-racism. In 2023, Michelle entered a new stage of life, retirement. Congratulations.
Thank you.
After working in a private Midwestern Christian liberal arts university for 38 years. Post-retirement, Michelle spends her time enjoying more of the things she loves: God, family, life, and food. So Michelle, welcome. Thank you for being here today. Your retirement.
I'm so excited to be with you today.
Excited to have you. And your retirement has been busy, to say the least. And I know
just a little bit.
Yes. And I know that I read several things that you're currently involved in. Curious if you could give our listeners a brief overview of the few of the things that you are currently involved in and you feel most passionate about.
Well, right now, what I'm most passionate about is taking care of an 8-month-old grandson. That's what I'm most passionate about. And his mother is my daughter and my son-in-law. I am very passionate about the Antioch Podcast, and I am overjoyed that I have more time to focus on the podcast, because I was working on the podcast while fully employed. And so not being so fully employed, I have a little bit more time to invest in that. We were able to onboard an intern recently, so look for more things to come out of the Antioch Podcast. So that's something I'm very excited about. Something that is in process, I will become faculty for an institute called the School of Contemplative Prayer. I'm going to have to look it up, the full name, because it starts next semester. But it is looking at contemplative practices at the intersection of doing justice work with this lens of diversity and cross-cultural relations on top of it. So I'm preparing for that to start in the spring. Ministry is something I'm also very passionate about and interested in. But I think if I look at proportions of time, the podcast is what's taking up most of my time, with a little bit of sprinkling of consulting every now and then.
Wow. So you really are busy in your retirement. You're not the type to...
There's a lot of down space. If you look at my schedule compared to when I was working, it looks like I'm not working.
But I was going to say, you're not the person who in retirement will just, I don't know, relax at the beach or do things outside of the work that you've been doing. Yeah.
I wanted to, but God had other plans. There was a beach somewhere with my name on it, but God said, no, I think there's a little bit more that you want to do. And after about a month of just a total breakaway from all the diversity work, the justice work, even ministry work, I felt refreshed enough that I could jump back in.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing that. I recently read an article that you wrote on Religious News titled, "Why Christians Need to Support Diversity Professionals, Not Demonize Them."
Yeah.
And now I'm going to read a brief quote and follow the question. So this is a quote. "Sadly, advocating for diversity, equity, and inclusion is often fraught with tension. Some of my deepest wounds have come from those claiming to be Christ's followers." Close quote. To the degree that you feel comfortable, Michelle, can you share an example from your own experiences?
Oh, wow. Yeah, there's a lot of examples that come to mind. I'm going to share first one of the most surprising examples. So one of the other labels that I carry is that I'm vegan. And my office, when I was working at Calvin, we had sponsored a well-known vegan speaker and advocate to come and give a presentation. So my name as representation of my office was on the poster. And the day after the presentation, and I went to the presentation, it was great. The day after the presentation, the president's office called me and said, we're forwarding this complaint to you. And the complaint was from someone who had not even attended the session. And they were concerned that we would have a vegan on campus because vegans weren't Christian. So I followed up with a more extended conversation, and they were coming up with some really absurd kinds of findings, that you can't, babies that are breastfed aren't really, nourished when their mothers are vegan, that you're not really the healthiest, and God created animals for us to eat. And I said, would you like me to have my doctor write a statement? My doctor would tell you that I'm one of the most boring patients health-wise that he has. And then I feel better. And I've done some writing on Christian veganism. It's like there is not a disconnect. So if you include dietary differences in this wide scope of diversity, that was one of the strangest and one of the most surprising ones. Some of the other ones, oh goodness, again, a phone call, because in my role as the executive associate to the president for diversity inclusion, when some of these calls would go to the president's office, he would forward them to me if it seemed like I could, in my field of expertise, answer it maybe a little bit better than he could answer it. But I would get the phone calls, and the first thing that is out of their mouths, like, are you teaching CRT? And it's like, well, what exactly do you mean by CRT? Because if you are using the true definition of CRT, to my knowledge, no, the university is not teaching CRT, right? That's usually a grad level class or something that people would have. But if you're meaning CRT in the unnuanced conversation that's going on around the nation that includes everything from teaching about white privilege, about whiteness, about microaggressions, then yes, we are teaching CRT and proudly doing so. In fact, since 2004, the university had approved a document stating that we were going to be an anti-racist organization. So yeah, we do. So those were some troubling ones. And then you have those who question even the need to do diversity work, who would say, oh, it can't be that bad, especially after President Barack Obama was in office. Like, well, we're not racist anymore because look, we have a Black president. It's like, oh, you don't get off that easy. So those are some of the things, the questioning of motive, the questioning that, is this even Christian? The questioning, is justice a part of should Christians be speaking up about justice? Should they even be involved in justice? And are they really oppressed? Are there really systemic things that are going on? Isn't this all about individual behaviors? So those are some of the things.
Appreciate you sharing those examples, Michelle. And as you're sharing them, I'm thinking ahead to some of the other questions that I have for you and how I have all these follow-ups. So hopefully we'll get to those, but thank you for sharing. And
all right.
As one follow-up, why do you think that Christian communities and individuals sometimes fall short in our efforts to understand and validate the experiences of, for example, people of color? Why do you think certain communities are just not understanding?
Well, the easiest answer and the quickest answer is because they don't know people of color, or they don't have proximity. And if they do have proximity, like, oh, my best friend in college was Black, and we were on fine. But did you talk about race? Even people who are in cross-racial intimate relationships, well, I'm not racist. But conversations about race? Do you have conversations about justice? I would bet money that you're not, because having conversations about race in terms of what does it mean? What does it mean for me to navigate this life in this body sometimes causes tension. I think there's also a desire. So, in addition to lack of proximity, there's a lack of desire to want to believe that these things could actually happen. And that's why I didn't mind sharing some of my stories, like, and this is true, being pulled over by the police while I was driving the speed limit on the highway. This is when I asked, why did you pull me over? You were driving the speed limit. What? And all I could think of is I'm a Black woman driving a new car with a sport package on it, and I was driving the speed limit. Why? So they can't believe that happens. And I like to share that that's something that happens to me, right? Being followed in the store, not receiving service. I mean, truly not receiving service. And the only thing I can think of is because I'm Black, because you're waiting on everyone else. But I'm a Black woman, but I played by the rules. I have a PhD. I am happily married. My children came after I was married, and all by the same guy. I am a Christian. I am heterosexual. So if I have all of these things, if all these things are going for me, and I still experience microaggressions, just flat out oppressions, that people look at me sideways. I like to tell people, when I walk into a store, people aren't usually, if they don't know me, they're probably not saying, I bet that woman has a PhD and she's ordained clergy and all her kids are from the same guy that she's been married to. I don't think that's the first thought that comes to people's minds, because that's not the stereotype that is associated with Black women. So lack of just not wanting to believe, because if you acknowledge that those things happen, then you're going to have to shift your way of thinking, and now you're responsible for doing something. So not wanting to acknowledge that what I'm experiencing is real lets you off the hook for having to do anything about it.
That's really powerful, Michelle. So there's a sense of perhaps subconsciously not wanting to take action, and that is influenced by or that then might lead one to invalidate or not believe another person. And in psychology, we often talk about experiential validity as being important, that your experiences, my experiences are valid, and to be able to recognize that even if I don't share in that experience. And so I hope that Christian communities and individuals can continue to grow in being able to validate the experiences of those who are marginalized or oppressed.
I think one other thing, there's a fear of the hyphen in some Christian circles, right? I identify myself as a Black Christian. Well, why do you have to use Black? Can't we all just be Christian? We all have the same blood. Our first identity should be our identity in Christ. And while I agree with that to a point, there's also my story that says the way I navigate life as a Black, and especially as a Black female Christian, is different than someone else who is navigating this Christian walk. So the stories that are told as a part of a sermon often don't reflect me or my experience. Certainly the common liturgy doesn't reflect my story. Right? So if you're a church and all you're preaching from the lectionary, and you have the standard kind of high church liturgy, that does not reflect my experience. And then when I try to advocate for bringing my culture into the worship setting so that I feel closer to God, so I see my image in this wider image of God, then I'm invalid, or I'm not a true Christian, or that's not the way things are done. You're not really worshiping. I've had a colleague question. I was playing gospel music in my office, minding my own business, stick his head in the office and say, that's not real Christian music. It's like, so you don't know that it's this music that's keeping me from saying what we want to say, which is uncharitable at the moment.
Right. Yeah, that idea that there's a definition of what Christianity should look like, right? And if we deviate from that standard, then there's an invalidation or criticism of that. Like in my research, I often encounter sort of these racial colorblindness themes that are embedded in Christian communities, including in my own Asian and Asian American communities, where they might have internalized the belief that Christianity should look like this white standard. And anything that moves away from that is viewed as lesser than, or maybe even in extreme cases, heretical, right? And so I'm continuing to identify those narratives. Like in my research, Michelle, I've done a study where we looked at images of Jesus and how subconsciously Asian American Christians rate white Jesus as more, I guess, favorable, right? Words that were more favorable, phrases that were more favorable compared to non-white Jesus images. And even that type of a psychological experiment shows that there is a standard that we've internalized and that we subconsciously express.
Right. And no one sat them down and said, you have to view white Jesus as this image that's inaccurate, but you have to view this image of Jesus as being the image. But because we see those pictures over and over and over again, and that's what's represented.
And what was telling in that study was that on paper, they'll say, yeah, I know that Jesus was non-white, right? That they're able to accurately say historically who Jesus was, but subconsciously, implicitly, they make these association where white Jesus is linked with more favorable words and favorable phrases. So I thought that was a very telling kind of a study.
Yeah, it is powerful.
In the same article, you wrote that isolation and alienation is a common experience to lead diversity efforts in higher education, including in Christian higher ed. And you've already talked about that a bit. I find that it's also true for faculty who are passionate about intentional teaching of DEI topics and themes, and we can often feel isolated and unsupported. What are some ways, in your opinion and in your experience, to counter these realities where folks who are teaching about these themes can feel more supported?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Some of it's going to depend on the institution. Some of it's going to depend on, do you have tenure or not? If that's your school grant tenure, there's a lot more that I could do than before. But seek out others who are teaching or engaged in teaching these kind of topics with this DEI lens. And sometimes, most of the time, where you find these other people are at other institutions, especially within Christian settings, right? And it can be difficult, but attending something like the CCCU Diversity Conference, which is happening next week, I believe, attending something like that. And the CCCU on their website, they even have a community for diversity practitioners and teachers and faculty. So reaching out to connect with other faculty members, especially those at other institutions. And most of the time, if you send an email, say, hey, I'm at such and such a university or such and such a college, I'm teaching this. I noted that you are doing something. Would you mind having a chat sometime? Hands down, people say, yes, I'd love to, because they're often feeling isolated or stuck as well. And if you can't find a community, build it. Build that community. And also look for professional organizations within your discipline and professional organizations within your community that might not have anything to do with higher education. It's just about being a professional. That is also another way that you can become less isolated and feel more connected to a body and feels more supported. And if you can't find people who are in your discipline or doing this kind of work, rely on those social relationships that fill you up. So in my book that I had written, one of the things that I said is that I have my best friend has not had any experience in higher education. She didn't attend college. She really didn't understand all the work that I did. And what we would do to chill out is we would watch Godzilla movies. That was just our thing, right? Even when she moved away, we would call each other and we would be on the phone watching the same Godzilla movie at the same time, commenting, right? So even understanding that you might not be able to find someone in your discipline or even doing this kind of work that you feel like you can be yourself with, that you can either dive deep into a conversation or not dive into it at all. It's okay to have friends to talk with and just to be with so you feel just connected and grounded. Because usually they have some wisdom to say, no, you're not crazy. Because even though my friend didn't understand all the things that were going on with the work that I was doing, she could tell me if I was crazy or not. Okay, this is what I'm thinking. This is what I experienced. Is this me? Am I being too sensitive? And as a voice of reason, she would often say, no, you're not. Or, Michelle, you need to sit down.
I love that though, because sometimes in academia we can be so like we can think that our culture is the norm, and then someone outside of academia could really speak into those realities, right, and give us a reality check.
Right.
As a follow-up, you mentioned also in your article that sometimes administrations can view DEI efforts as nice things but non-essentials, and I found that to be true as well. Not necessarily administration using the word non-essential, but treating like a program or an office or sometimes positions as, yeah, it's nice if we have the budget, we can have this, but otherwise this might be one of the first things to go. So I'm curious, can you speak into that? Like when DEI efforts are not viewed as essentials, like what might be your response and what actions might you take?
So am I being professional when I'm talking with an administration? That's the first question.
The floor is yours. Yes. I know you're beyond tenure. You have tenure and beyond.
I'm
so
tenured and retired. So
yeah.
you know, and within all seriousness, I think the first place to start is with the individual understanding whether or not there is a sense of calling for them to be a voice and to be engaged in this work. That's the first thing. Because if this is God prompting you, God leading you, God inspiring you, God will either open the doors, change hearts, or His grace will be sufficient for you to get through the next day and the next day and the next day. If this is not God's leading, this is just you saying, this is important, and why isn't this institution doing this? I'm going to speak truth to power, and you will listen to me. I don't think God honors that, because that's out of our own flesh, our own desire. So the first thing to do is to do this internal check. What's your motivation? What's your why? If you land on the side, yep, this is God's calling, this is God's leading. Then the second question you need to ask yourself, can you trust God's timing? Or does it have to be on your timetable? I waited 30 years for Calvin to change its faculty membership requirement. Its faculty membership requirement is in order to be a tenured faculty, you needed to be a member of the Christian Reformed Church in North America.
Right.
When I started at Calvin, I was not a member of the Christian Reformed Church. When I was up for tenure, and at every point of reappointment, I was found to be in non-compliance because I was ordained in another denomination. And at that time, the Christian Reformed Church did not affirm or welcome women in Christian office. So it was either give up my calling, telling God, God, you made a mistake. I can't preach your gospel because my job won't let me. Or tell my job, look, my arms are too short to box with God. I'm going to follow God. So I said, I'm going to follow God. You can do whatever you want. I'm going to trust God. Wonders of wonders. I say this was that minor earthquake that happened in Grand Rapids when I was granted tenure, not being Christian Reformed, my children not going to private Christian school. I was only the second person to be granted tenure without fulfilling the faculty membership requirement. And I should say since then that has been changed.
Right.
But It took 30 years for that policy to change. I worked 30 years. When there was, hey, anyone has suggestions of what we can do to remove barriers? You can do this. No, it was not an intentional. It wasn't saying we want to exclude non-Dutch people, but it had the impact of excluding non-Dutch people if they came from a tradition otherwise. When that was passed in 2020, and I know it was 2020 because it was a virtual board meeting, when it passed without tension, like, well, of course. And believe me, there had been attempts before where it's like voted down.
Oh, wow.
When that happened, I had to turn off my mic and my camera because I was in tears. It's like, what? This actually happened. So that's why I can tell people, are you trusting your timing? Because if God called you to it, He'll get you through it. So are you trusting your timing or God's timing? And then, depending on your position within the organization, if you don't have a seat at the table where policies are made, make friends with people who are at the seat, who are at the table. If you can gain an ally from someone who is influential and can speak up, make that connection, not using them as a puppet or anything, but they'll have your words, your relationship in mind when those decisions are being made. And then the other thing, if you're not at those seats, find ways to get on certain committees so that your voice is heard, and respectfully ask for the changes that you want to see. Don't start off with, you're a racist institution because you do this. No one's going to listen. However, if you, again, this is playing the long game. If you have shown yourself to be faithful, to be a good institutional player, team player, represents the institution well, if you're not crying racism every 5 minutes, they'll listen to you when you speak up.
Wow, these are really powerful but also practical advice. Thank you so much, Michelle. And as I'm hearing you talk about this, I'm also struck by the intentional sort of faith integration into this approach where you're prayerful, you're thinking about God's timing. And that's very countercultural to what our society tells us to do when it comes to talking about these topics, right?
Yeah, I had to learn the hard way. Believe me, there are many times I was in the floor crying. It's like, God, why aren't you doing this? Like, whoa, whose timetable are we on, Michelle? I was like, oh, okay. Because you don't know what God is up to. God has to move people out of the way, either, just because of turnover, or sometimes God has to do a work in your heart. What's your motivation? The climate, socially, politically, historically, has to change. So you don't know what God is up to in the process. It's just easier and harder to just trust God.
Easier and harder, yes. Both are true. And I think your contemplative aspect comes in as well, where you are prayerful, thinking about the internal motivations. I think, again, in our society, it's all about the external. It's all about the action. It's all about what's visible. And you're saying we also need to examine our intrinsic motivation for what we're doing. It's hard to do, right? But it's something that we're called to do as Christians.
And that's that contemplative process, and that willingness to play the long game, that willingness to work within the structure and not just be the person outside throwing bricks and rocks at the wall and calling down fire on the institution, is also this. It's the thing that gets results. It's also the things that draws criticism from the inside, right? Because I have had people who were allies, air quotes, in the work, but very frustrated with my approach. Very frustrated. And we're not shy about saying it. I must have sold out. I must not be serious about that. I must not be willing to trouble the waters, so to speak. But what they didn't know is all the conversations I was having that I wasn't broadcasting, right? No, these are some conversations I was having, these come to Jesus moments with administrators and presidents. But I wasn't going out saying, oh, and I told them this, or no, I'm planting the seeds, I'm doing the work, but I'm not blasting people. I'm not disrespecting those who are in authority. And I'm going to come out on a united front, whether that was strictly my opinion or not, because in my opinion, that's the way that I can be a more effective leader and that they'll trust me in the process. So that very thing. So when you talk about being isolated and disrespected or alienated, it's not just from the people who don't think diversity is valuable. Sometimes it's from the very people who should be your strongest allies, because they are all about justice too. But when you're when you are the person leading these efforts, but they don't think you're doing it the right way because it's not the way that you're doing, and because you're not calling down fire and brimstone on the institution, you're not speaking truth to power in the way that they want you to, then you're crossed off the list. You're crossed off the list. You're not, as they say, well, as in God's word, a prophet is without honor in their own town. And that's the way it is for a lot of diversity professionals, not just from the naysayers, but also from the supporters. For a long, long time, I was celebrated more outside of my institution than I was inside of my institution. Other institutions would call me to come to speak, but sometimes not at my own institution. And that's just part of doing this work. But again, I knew that God had called me to the work, and I had to trust God for the outcome.
It's thank you for sharing. It's so painful, right? When your own community, especially those who should be allies, like you said, say and do things that are hurtful. And I don't know if middle ground is the right word, but to seek a more nuanced and thoughtful approach sometimes is met with, oh, maybe you're not doing enough, kind of a criticism.
Right.
That can be super hurtful. Yeah.
Right. Especially when they don't know everything that's going on. Right. You haven't sat down and asked me, what are you doing? Do you have a 5-year plan? Yes, I've got all kinds of plans. You haven't asked me, well, what are the limitations that are in your place? For some reason, people have thought I had a magic wand and all I had to do was wave it and things would change, right? Yeah. No. It's a lot of hard work that goes in. It's culture shifting. It's not easy work, but it's valuable and needful work.
Yes, yeah. And what you shared, Michelle, reminded me of my own experiences where sometimes in my own community, different DEI agendas conflict with each other or seemingly conflict with each other, where I've heard the phrase diversity Olympics being used, where one group might advocate for their own belonging and inclusion in a way that other groups might say, hey, what about us, right? And sometimes that can be a very challenging but necessary conversation to have, where we're all winning, right, rather than one group benefiting at the expense of the other. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and I think that is something that the system that has been created to privilege some and marginalize others is working very well. Because if they can split us, if they can have us not supporting one another, if they can have us suspicious of one another, trying to take the spotlight from the other, none of us succeed.
Right. And that system wins, right?
The system wins. The system wins. And so it continues on.
I'm sure you're aware of this as a sociologist, but internalized model minority stereotype is something that I often talk about in the Asian American context, where, as you described, Asians are often viewed as the model minority, and then sometimes that can create tensions between racial minority groups, where Asian Americans might be pointed as, hey, they're the most model group, right? Where they've achieved, and why can't the other groups be like the Asian Americans? And that type of messaging that's part of the system can be, again, perpetuated and super hurtful and might brew resentment among communities of color.
Yeah, I mean, and you see it even in some institutions of higher education, definitely public. I'm not as sure about Christian. It's like, well, Asian students don't need scholarships. If we gave them scholarships, or if we only admitted based on merit, there would be so many Asian students. There wouldn't be anyone else. It's like, well, wait, you can't change the game. You made the rules. You shaped the game. You made the rules, and then when you weren't winning anymore, you want to change it. No, you can't do that.
Right.
And it's not taking into consideration the sacrifices that have been made to reach such achievement, or B, that not everyone is like that.
It's a stereotype, and
it's a stereotype.
The Asian group is huge, right? There's so much diversity within the Asian group.
Yes.
Yeah. You've again already mentioned this somewhat, but our society is incredibly polarized when it comes to DEI topics and people who do this kind of work. I find that people are often boxed into certain, I guess, stereotypes where, like that phone call you received about CRT, where people are automatically associated with doing things that are unchristian or divisive. And I'm curious if you've had experiences where people have perpetuated that kind of stereotype with you, and how you responded, how you coped with that kind of an approach.
It depends on which day of the week it is. I try to listen to what's behind what someone is saying. If there is just flat out anger, I don't care what, you're not going to persuade me. I give myself permission to not deal with the person. Right. So the anonymous letters underneath the door, it was anonymous. I don't have to read it or respond to it.
Yes. Did you get a lot of those? I'm sorry.
I wouldn't say I've gotten a lot of those, but I've gotten some of those. Right. So for those who are bold enough, I say, if you're bold enough to make a claim, you should be bold enough to put your name with it. And I should be able to, if you want to have a conversation, I'm willing to have a conversation, but it needs to be a dialogue. I am not going to be your doormat. I'm not going to receive abuse. You're not going to yell at me. You're not going to demonize my character. I don't have to do that. So if it's not a civil discussion, and we could end the discussion being on opposite ends, but having at least an understanding of where the other person is coming from. I'm fine with that. No one has to think like me, but it has to be a conversation. So if you don't want to have a discussion, I don't have to keep chasing after you to change your mind, because it's not me that's going to change your mind. It's the Holy Spirit that's going to change your mind. For people who want to have a conversation, and I have had this situation where someone, I had, sending out invitations to participate in some diversity training. And I had an encounter with someone who worked in facilities, right? Cleaning the hallways, classrooms and stuff. And they said, well, you're that person that sends that out to us. What does that have to do with us? You're in the academic, we're a facility. What does that have to do with us? This doesn't really matter. And what I realized in that moment was that this was a group of people that I had not paid attention to, right? Faculty, staff, students, I had paid attention to. And so I found out that this person with some other facilities people met for coffee every morning at 7:30 for their break, because they were this morning shift. And I asked if one time I could come and just get to know them.
Right.
Oh, that first meeting, you would have thought it was one of these old film noir movies where there was this spotlight on me and they had rubber hoses, right? Because they were just shooting these kinds of questions, really suspicious of while I was there, because I was administration and no one from administration comes to talk with them. But I came back and we ended up for 3 years, the 3 years before COVID, meeting almost every Wednesday morning at 7:30 in the morning. It got to the point where that person who had initially said, what does this have to do with me, asked me if he and I could co-lead a training for the rest of facilities.
Wow, that's amazing.
And we did. And what he wanted to do, because he said, Michelle, he says, I'm hearing things questions that people have, but they don't want to ask you because they don't want to look like they're racist. But what if you and I kind of did like a talk show thing? I interview you and I ask those questions. and then you answer them. And when they see that you're not beating me up for asking the questions and that you're actually answering them, I think that will go a long way. Oh, that was the best experience. And so that's to show, yes, I will walk with you. If you really want to understand, if you really want to have a conversation, I will meet with you. And this was me living 45 minutes away from campus, right? Getting up to be there at 7:30 in the morning.
Yeah.
But if you don't want to have a conversation, you just want to vent, you just want to tell me that I'm not Christian, I don't have to have a conversation with you. So that's my response.
I love that example where, again, your intentional relational approach comes in, where you just showed up, right? And showing up. Is,
no agenda. It wasn't like, hey, this is all the programming and how come you don't show up? No, I just want to be in this space with you. When there were some days I needed to take my administrative hat off because of the conversations that was going on, because it's like, oh, that was a rather crude way of saying something, but hey, I'm in your private space. And sometimes, they would be venting, like, oh, administration. I would raise my hand and say, you all do realize that I'm administration, right? Oh, right. No, we don't mean you. We don't mean you. But that was the relationship that we had built. They trusted me so much. So again, that same individual, we ended up reading a couple of books together, and I was sharing how it was around Christmas time or approaching Christmas time. And I was sharing how hard it was to find Black nutcrackers, those nutcrackers with those wooden kind of soldiers. And that, it's hard to find because it was something about symbolism and representation. We're having a conversation. And I had jokingly said, yeah, if you find one, let me know. I'll, if you get it, I'll buy it from you. And do you know that person found one?
Wow. How did they find it?
And he gave it to me as a gift.
Yeah.
Because
amazing.
He said, hey, I remember you saying these were so hard to find. I found this, thought about you, and I just wanted you to have it. So it's a long game. You can't just beat people over the head with facts. It's about relationship. Yes. And it's through relationships. You also work on changing structures. You change structures through policy analysis and changes, speaking up, using a cultural lens when you're developing policies, implementing policies, assessing policies. That's how you change structures. But you change cultures with relationships. And that takes time. And that means being willing to be vulnerable. It means being willing to not always be right, not always to be, you don't have to assert yourself as being the smartest person in the room or the most credentialed person in the room.
Right.
It didn't, they respected the fact that I had a PhD, but it wasn't important to them that I had a PhD. We did a book study on nickel and dime, not nickel and dime. It was a book similar to something like nickel and dime. Oh my gosh, they hated that book.
It was like because it was hard to read. The content was hard to
it wasn't
accept.
hard to read, but it was the person. They said the person was so whiny, that oh, you don't really know what it's like. I mean, oh my goodness, they hate. And I said, you know what? You're the only group, because faculty and staff were always very polite, in their discussion. They just said what they really felt. I was like, this is so refreshing.
Right. Wow, you answered my follow-up question, which was about how you personally respond to polarization. And I've had some colleagues, respected colleagues, who say, I am tired of being in a, for example, white dominant system, and I want to step away, right, and be in my own community and doing the work of empowering my own community to this work. And so I think you answered part of that question of what is the response to this polarization. And for you, Michelle, it sounds like you were able to pray and wait for God's timing, but also find ways to relationally connect with folks in a way that benefited them. Again, I know you talked a little bit about the principles already, but let's focus our, third to the last question on teaching. So you have lots of experience as a teacher and also as an administrator. What are some overall broad principles about DEI that can benefit teachers who are teaching about these topics, and also for faculty of color who might be teaching about this especially? Oh
boy, okay. I'll start with faculty of color first, because I just want to be specific.
Yeah.
If you're teaching about diversity topics, Even if diversity is in your course title, more than likely you're going to be accused of being racist, sexist, classist, whatever it is. Even when you're not, just teaching the course, you're going to get pushback. So one, expect that, right? I had a colleague teaching about race, a history of race, had a student complain on student teacher evaluations that all he talked about was race. It was a class on race.
Oh my goodness.
So be prepared for that. And I would say for all teachers, be upfront about the value of diversity within the classroom. I would, no matter what class, even though the majority of the classes I taught were on topics of diversity, I would be upfront that this class is going to talk about diversity. This class we might talk about some hard things, or it might be presented in a way that's different from the way that you have thought about it. I want everyone to feel safe in the classroom. And the only way that we can all feel safe in the classroom is if we're all willing to listen, right? I said, and no question is off limits unless it's a question designed to hurt someone, right? So, for example, you can't ask a question like, why are all Black people criminals? Just because all the Black people you know are criminals, right? You can't ask a question. You can ask a question, why is the criminal justice system overrepresented with Black men and brown men? Where you can ask that question, right? Because this is what higher education is about. This should be the safest place to ask those kind of questions. And if you feel some kind of way about something that was said, I had an ouch clause that what you could do, you could say ouch either for yourself, or if you think it's an ouch on behalf of someone who's not represented in the room. Right? So maybe no one has outed themselves as being within the LGBTQ community. And maybe some comment was made in a discussion or, from other students about LGBTQ that wasn't affirming or positive. You could say ouch, even though you're not a member of that community. And when someone says ouch, that means we push pause. So let's talk about this. I also, especially in early level classes, would periodically hand out little index cards. And there's probably electronic ways to do this now, but back in the dark ages before we used office electronic. But they could anonymously write something that's going well in the class, something that they're concerned about, something that they want to know more about. And that was just continuous feedback. And so if there is especially if I could address something within the class, say, hey, I saw several of these comments, and so I just want to address that. This isn't outing anyone. The other thing I would say, if you are just, only because I'm Black, and I just keep bringing up Black, if you're teaching something about Black Americans and you have 2 Black Americans in the classroom, don't ask the 2 Black Americans to speak about their experiences. Because they might not see themselves as African American. Their skin might look like that, but you don't know who's been cross-racially adopted, and that's not how they were raised, or they're trying to get away from that identity. They just want to be human. They don't want to be Black or Asian or Latinx on campus. They just want to be human. And it's unfair. Or they might understand themselves as Black, but not really have a grasp on the Black experience, because we were all trained in the same public or private school system, right? And that was my experience growing up. Always knew I was African American because there were always people to remind me in unkind ways that I was. But because of my father's military experience, we didn't live around African Americans much. And so when we came back stateside, this will date me, but I don't mind it. I was a teenager, ran into a group of African-American girls and said, don't you just love Michael Jackson? And I was like, who's Michael Jackson? I had no idea. And they said, well, what music, what singer do you like or listen to? Johnny Cash, because that's what, that's
Yeah.
what I heard. Right. And they were like,
Mm-hmm.
what are you? Are you really
Mm-hmm.
Black? Yes. I just wasn't in that environment. So that's the other thing I would say to teachers. Don't ask if anyone would have a comment. And then this is another practice that I also had when I was teaching. If I knew there were topics that were going to come up that might be uncomfortable
Mm-hmm.
for a particular category of students, I would have a meeting with those students, but this was in the guise of I met with every student within the first 3 weeks of class, individually, one-on-one.
Wow.
And for those particular students, I would say, hey, we're going to have a conversation. We're going to talk about mass incarceration of Black and Latino people. I want you to know that I'm not going to call on you to say anything.
Right.
But if you want to, you can. Is there anything you're concerned about? I just want to give you a heads up. We're going to have these conversations. And people were appreciative of that.
I love that. I'm making mental notes here, Michelle, as you give this wealth of knowledge about teaching. I love that last part, especially because it allows you to, on one hand, like you said, not stereotype the students in the class,
Right.
but also allows you to invite them to speak into their experiences if they
Right.
wanted to. And so
Yeah.
you're not for sure doing a colorblind approach, but rather saying, I'm not going to assume that you're at this stage, but if you
Right.
would like to share, then you're
Yeah.
welcome to share.
Yeah. And then it gives them, when you meet privately one-on-one, I always ask, is there anything I should know about you as I'm teaching this class? Right? And you don't want to ask that in front of everybody, but is there anything that I should know about you? And it also gave me a way to hear them speak,
Yeah.
especially if I knew someone was an international student, right? As opposed to assuming they didn't understand, they were having struggles and, speaking English or understanding English. If I'm meeting one-on-one with them, I can determine that in that conversation.
Right.
I cannot, I've had at least a couple faculty members that I've had to do an intervention with because, on the first day of class, they spied usually, a Korean student in class and said, very slowly in front of everybody, if you need help with English, you can go to the Rhetoric Center. And it turns out, the person was born in LA.
Yeah. They speak fine. It's their native language. Yeah.
Speak fluent English.
Oh my
They have
goodness.
trouble with Korean.
Yeah. Talk about a microaggression in front of other
Yes.
students. Yeah.
Right. And then having to help the faculty member understand why that was not a good thing. They
Right.
really thought they were being helpful because they had experience in the past
Right.
with a Korean student that was struggling because they didn't comprehend English as well. I said, but you made an assumption. I said, you didn't even ask the student their name or say hello. You just went up to them in front of everybody. We worked a whole semester on that one.
Oh my goodness. And talk about a great opportunity to introduce the idea of intent versus impact, right? They might have
Yes.
intended something that was helpful, but
Yes.
the consequence was far from it.
Right.
So, Michelle, I have two questions that I ask all people that come on the podcast. And again, there's overlaps here with the questions before, but one is, as I told you, the primary audience for this podcast includes folks who are interested in Christian higher education. So younger faculty or even advanced graduate students who are thinking about teaching in Christian higher ed. If you have like one advice for them, what might that be as they start to begin their careers or think about beginning their careers?
I would say see each student as an individual and wake up excited about teaching a class. If you are finding that you are not excited about teaching a class, you need to ask yourself why. Because if you're not excited, your students are going to feel it.
They pick up on that, right?
They pick up on that.
Yeah. Good advice. And then my last question is kind of a fun one. If you could ask my next guest, without knowing who that is, because I don't know off the top of my head who that is.
Mm-hmm.
Any question about teaching psychology or a related discipline like sociology, what would it be? And it can be a fun question, it can be a deep question, or in between.
Yeah, so there's one question I would ask was like, how did you know that psychology was the discipline that you wanted to dive into? And then if I was being funny, I would say, why not sociology? Sociology is, the queen of the social sciences.
It's very closely related, right? I often, especially as someone who looks at more systemic contributors to mental health, I wonder sociology seems really attractive as a major, right? Yes. Thank you for that question. Anything else, Michelle, that you would like to say before we hit the stop record button? This has been an amazing experience for me.
Yeah, this has been good. I appreciate this. When I wrote the essay, I was a month out from retiring, and our chief communication officer has said, hey, Michelle, there's a group that I'm working with, and they're wondering if you'd be willing to write an op-ed piece, just kind of highlighting, and celebrating your tenure at Calvin. It's like, would anybody read when I wrote about this? And so I said, yeah, I'll do it, but I want to make sure I'm fully retired before I wrote it. Wrote it. So I wrote it, I sent it. He liked it, was excited about it. And then they said, okay, we'll shop it around and see if anybody will pick it up. So I was surprised someone picked it up. And I've been surprised that people have read it. So thank you for reading it. And I should say, I have gotten some positive comments about that essay and also some negative comments about that essay. Right?
Oh my goodness. First of all, it was widely shared in my networks. I saw it pop up a few times on LinkedIn and other social media platforms. So I hope that you realize that many people were reading it, but also not surprising about the comments. I've decided when I write something that's more public facing that I will not look at the negative comments, right? But sometimes it's hard not to. And
it was like, wow, there are comments. Let me look. I was like, what? Wait a minute.
Oh my goodness.
I was like, you know what? I don't have time for this today.
Do you respond to the comments, or do you try to? Or okay,
no, it's because it wasn't written to start a conversation on LinkedIn or anywhere else. It was written about a response to what I was seeing. Right. So what I was seeing, diversity professionals on Christian higher ed campuses before 2020 was in an iffy kind of position. There weren't a whole lot of diversity professionals. There might be some faculty who are interested, but there weren't a lot who are doing this work.
Right.
Then 2020 happens. George Floyd is murdered. There's a call for institution accountability. And now all these institutions, right, are needing a chief diversity officer. And I don't think they were really caring who was the chief diversity officer. They just needed to say they had a chief diversity officer. So if you do this, and maybe I'm saying that a little bit more aggressively than I should, but that's sometimes what it felt like. Because I was seeing people being put in these roles that had no experience. And as you're doing this work, you have to have some credibility. And I was seeing people burnt out. I was seeing people in these roles with no resources being questioned on their campus. So here they're feeling good, like my campus is finally doing something about this. And I'm going to help lead this effort. But I'm not getting any support. I don't have a budget. I don't have any resources. The president isn't saying negative things, but they're not saying positive things about this. And what we're seeing since 2020, all these schools and non-academic organizations who brought on chief diversity officers, these chief diversity officers are leaving, or their programs are being eliminated, their roles and offices are being eliminated. They're not staying. And they're not staying because of all the things that I said in the article, right? Doing this work has never been for the faint of heart, but it has even more difficult now because you are not just fighting to make cultural changes on your campus, but it's this national, I don't even want to say conversation because it's not a conversation. It's this demonizing of anything that has to do with diversity. If I share that I've experienced a microaggression, now I'm accused of being divisive. But if I'm experiencing microaggressions, yes, I can choose how to respond to it. But if they're frequent enough, then it's giving me a message that I'm not welcome, I don't belong. But you're saying as a Christian organization that you want me to belong, that we're all one body. I'm trying to tell you that we're not. So you really don't want me here. And then you're wondering why we're walking away from the church.
Yeah.
All right, I'll get off my soapbox.
Thank you. I wholeheartedly agree. And I think what I'm getting from that response, Michelle, is the importance of not only taking action, like hiring a chief diversity officer, but also changing our culture and changing our structure so that we can support that person and we can sustain that work rather than having them burn out and walk away.
Right. Just to say, oh, we did it. We responded. Institutions are being called to be accountable. So the easiest thing that we can do is write a diversity statement. Oh, look, and now we have a chief diversity officer, but you haven't equipped them. You haven't supported them. You haven't allowed them to get training or positioned them to get training. And what you're doing is asking them to put out fires that have existed for a long time, and you haven't given them a fire truck to work with the fire.
It's powerful. Thank you, Michelle. And again, appreciate this conversation so much. It's been life-giving for me too.
Thank you for listening to the Cross-Cultural Psych Podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you will join us next time.